The early 80s saw a meteoric rise in the video game industry. The success of Space Invaders and Pac-Man had invigorated the video games market, and every company under the sun wanted to get in on the action. Investors were all in on this whole new world of home entertainment. Hiring was at an all-time high, and more video games and consoles were produced than ever before. The golden age of arcade video games lasted from the late 70s to the early 80s, where the industry saw rapid advances in technology and became seriously considered as the next evolution of entertainment. 1982 was the peak of this period, the market ballooning to its largest size in 2 decades, between $3.1 billion and $3.8 billion in market cap. And then, just as it ballooned, it all fell apart. The enthusiasm for video games created a bubble that collapsed in on itself. The market was oversaturated with choices for video game consoles. Children had dozens of consoles to choose from, and the games that worked on one console didn't work on another, which meant that there was little continuity in their gaming experience. Companies were under the impression that video games were easy to make, which flooded the market with broken shovelware. Famously, the publisher of the E.T. video game only gave the developers 6 weeks to develop and test it, resulting in one of the worst games of all time. Companies like Quaker Oats and Purina dog food were making video games. In late 1982, Atari attempted to curb this tidal wave of poor quality, rushed video games by filing suit. They lost this lawsuit, and this precedent declared that it was now open season for third-party developers to create video games for any system that they chose. At the same time, home computer manufacturers were embroiled in a price war, which meant that personal computers were more accessible than they had ever been. Home computers could not only play video games, but they could do a bunch of other stuff, which made them a lot more attractive than consoles. All of this led to gun-shy investors, toy stores pulling video game consoles off the shelves, and newspapers and magazines gleefully declaring that the age of video games was well and truly over. The market shrunk from over $3 billion to $100 million. This is a contraction of 97%. The video game industry was on life support. If it wasn't rescued, and soon, it would have led to a decades-long dark age for video game development. To put this in context, we would have been just entering the PlayStation 2 era now. But thankfully, a savior did appear, the Nintendo Entertainment System. The NES was widely released in the US in 1986, taking the country by storm. It had practically resolved all of the problems that led to the market crash of 1983. While Atari sought a legal solution to shovelware, Nintendo took a different approach. They implemented a checking integrated circuit, CIC for short, and colloquially known as the lockout chip. This chip introduced a handshake mechanism between the cartridge and the NES, effectively preventing third-party publishers from producing games for the NES on their own terms, without the express permission of Nintendo. Of course, later on, enterprising companies would find ways around this lockout chip, but by then it was far too late. Nintendo produced fewer, much higher quality games that didn't rely on false advertising on the covers for sales. These games would also come with a Nintendo seal of quality, which assured consumers and investors alike that these games weren't garbage. The NES single-handedly breathed life back into the gaming industry and had conquered 85% of the market for Nintendo in 1991. By all accounts, the NES was a technological marvel. The NES is also the centerpiece of the film we're talking about today, 8-Bit Christmas. The source material was a book and a screenplay, both written by author Kevin Jakubowski, loosely drawing on his childhood in Batavia, Chicago in the late 80s. He wrote the book with the express intent of turning it into a movie and wrote the screenplay shortly after the completion of the novel. The book was a commercial success and the screenplay earned the top spot on the Blacklist, a website for reviewing screenplays. This earned the attention of producers and eventually the interest of Warner Brothers. 8-Bit Christmas recaptures very universal elements of most of our childhoods. The single-minded desire for something your parents simply won't buy you, the jealousy of the neighborhood kid who has all the things you want, and the sheer terror of getting into trouble with your dad. As time chugs along and you become an adult, these incidents feel small, kind of insignificant, but in that moment they are everything. 8-Bit Christmas represents those feelings extremely well. It's a viscerally real exploration of childhood, stretched in just the right places so it's entertaining for the audience. If that sounds good to you, please do watch this film. Plot spoilers from here on out. The story takes place as one long flashback sequence. Jake Doyle, our protagonist, has a 12-year-old daughter who desperately wants a cell phone and Jake just doesn't want to buy her one. She's at her grandparents' place for Christmas and is terribly bored. So Jake decides to entertain her with a story, his quest to obtain an NES for Christmas. The NES is our MacGuffin here. The word MacGuffin was coined by Alfred Hitchcock, one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. It is an object that the protagonist, and sometimes the antagonist, will sacrifice everything to obtain. Despite its obvious centrality to the plot, Hitchcock was convinced that the MacGuffin is in actuality nothing at all. Hitchcock explained that you could replace the MacGuffin with an empty, absurd, and meaningless thing and the plot will remain virtually unchanged. The story is driven by the MacGuffin, but it isn't about the MacGuffin. While the MacGuffin is a very specific object, the story is a lot more universal. Very few people today want an NES, and very few people also want a Red Ryder BB gun like in A Christmas Story. What they can relate to is that desperate desire, that childhood craving. And that's what makes A Christmas Story so beloved to this day, not the BB gun, but the universal human story that's built around it. 8-Bit Christmas demonstrates the meaninglessness of the MacGuffin early and effectively. Adult Jake Doyle only thinks of the NES when his daughter says she's bored, and it's presented as this plain grey box. Which of course, that's what it is. He has left the NES at his parents' house, a place he probably doesn't visit all that often. The second time we see the NES, this time from young Jake's perspective, there's bright lights and smoke surrounding it. Adult Jake sees it as a plain grey box that could help him entertain his daughter, while young Jake sees it as a glamorous and mysterious object of desire. The NES starts out being extremely important to Jake, and as he grows older and wiser, it loses the charm it had, becoming almost meaningless to the adult version of our protagonist. 8-Bit Christmas follows the 3-act structure rather well. In the first act, the film introduces all the characters in the story and describes their features. Jake has a group of friends, and even some hangers-on are introduced, each with a very specific characteristic that comes up throughout the film. Aside from Jake Doyle, all the characters in the film are flat, as described by E.M. Forster in his 1927 book, Aspects of the Novel. To understand what a flat character is, we must first look at its opposite, the round character. Round characters are complex and dynamic, which means they undergo a significant internal change over the course of a narrative. These are flawed characters that are defined by several, sometimes contradictory traits, and are capable of surprising the audience because they are not defined by stereotypes. Round characters are as close to human as possible within the realm of fiction. They require a high degree of effort and scene presence to develop, And since films are shorter form than books or TV shows, you typically see only the protagonist fitting this description. On the other hand, you can have several flat characters. Sometimes called two-dimensional, these characters are simple and uncomplicated. Unlike round characters, they conform to a particular stereotype. They cannot surprise the audience because they act logically and consistently according to their one or two character traits. 8-Bit Christmas utilizes flat characters to their fullest extent, involving every one of their traits in the climax of the film. We're introduced to Jake Doyle's friend group in rapid succession. Mikey Trotter, the only kid in the group allowed to watch R-rated movies, Evan Olsen, who's allergic to SpaghettiOs, Tammy Hodges, the baseball card collector and twin of Teddy Hodges, and Jeff Farmer, the pathological lawyer. All of these characters have a single trait that remains consistent throughout the film. The only one that doesn't get a special trait is Teddy Hodges, but I guess he's kind of a package deal with his twin sister. The group is gathered in front of Timmy Keen's house. Timmy is the neighborhood spoiled rich kid who gets everything he wants. He invites some of the gang to play Nintendo in his basement, and little Jake Doyle sees the NES for the first time, and he's completely hypnotized. Now Timmy, being a spoiled brat, doesn't give anyone a turn to play. Jake realizes that Timmy Keen isn't the way to gain access to a Nintendo. He would have to get his own. This is the inciting incident of 8-Bit Christmas. This event sets the main characters on the path that will occupy them for the rest of the narrative. He starts with the most basic plan, convincing his parents to get one for him. Jake's mom is a habitual multitasker, so she agrees without thinking too hard about it. Jake's dad is a hobbyist craftsman with a forgetful streak, and he agrees to buy his son the Nintendo because he thinks it's a power tool. Jake's victory is short-lived, and after a brief and more wrong than right conversation about video games at the dinner table, his parents catch on to his scheme and refuse to get him one. We're then introduced to Jagorsky, the quintessential bully trope character, who isn't very important in the narrative other than as occasional antagonism and comic relief. Timmy Keen gets the new Power Glove for the NES, a notoriously terrible device whose hype exceeded its functionality. It was even marketed through a feature film called The Wizard, but that's a review for another time. After failing to defeat Tammy Hodges in a fighting game, this happened.
Lying under the weight of a smashed 42-inch television set was a dead dog.
The dog getting crushed is the event that shocks the adults in the community into taking a much more hardline stance against video games. Jeffrey Farmer finds a new way for the gang to obtain a Nintendo. The loyal Ranger Scouts are giving away a Nintendo as the grand prize for a wreath selling contest. The gang is obviously skeptical because Farmer is a pathological liar, but he obtains proof in the form of a flyer, and the plan is back on. We now enter the fun and games section of the plot, according to Blake Snyder's Save the Cat 3-act structure. This section is where you grow closer to your characters, explore the world, and are entertained by the promise of the premise. This is where the detective interviews his first suspects, the superhero begins to understand and experiment with his powers, or the star-crossed lovers go on dates and get to know each other. In 8-Bit Christmas, the group of friends and hangers-on compete with each other to sell the most wreaths and to win the almost mythical Nintendo. Around this time, the B-plot unfolds with Jake's sister. She has her own designs for a toy this Christmas, a Cabbage Patch Kid with red hair and freckles. She shows Jake the way to sell more wreaths than anyone else at the old folks' home. But this comes at a price. Jake has to help convince his parents to buy her the Cabbage Patch Kid. Near the end of the fun and games section, Jake gets his first hands-on experience with the NES. His parents are at the mall Christmas shopping, and he's left alone to mind his sister. He gets distracted by the Nintendo display and forgets to pay attention to Lizzie. This is Jake's fatal flaw. the world melts away from him when he's playing video games, making him forget all of his responsibilities. But his sister wasn't his only responsibility. He wears a retainer which he has dropped on the floor. This results in a fun little chase sequence because Jake's dad wants to look in his mouth to see if the retainer was still there. The inclusion of the mall section, splitting up the selling of the wreaths, and the outcome of the wreath selling contest is important in the editing process. Including a little section of fun and games before wrapping up this arc emphasizes that the events take place over a linear time frame and builds up suspense in the audience for the outcome of this contest. Jake wins the contest, but this turns out to be a false victory. The parents had rallied against video games so much that the loyal Ranger Scouts had changed the grand prize from a Nintendo to a bunch of encyclopedias. This scene is incredibly well done. It builds suspense, has great comedic timing, and utilizes slow motion in a way that shows just how much of a disaster that this reveal was. Winning a bunch of encyclopedias instead of a Nintendo might have been an absolute catastrophe, but all is not lost. Tammy Hodges opens up a pack of baseball cards and finds a misprint worth $98. This turns the gang on to their best chance of obtaining a Nintendo, selling a bunch of baseball cards for cash at the local hobby shop and using that money to purchase a Nintendo. Here they use Tammy's one character trait. She's the baseball card genius of the group. Getting the money was only half the battle though. Their parents, now galvanized against the concept of video games, would never take them to the mall to purchase one. They'd have to find another way. So they come up with a plan, one that utilizes all of their talents, so to speak. During their class field trip, they'd feed Evan Olsen SpaghettiOs, so he throws up at exactly the right time, causing the bus to stop. Then Jake would head on in, purchase the Nintendo, and get back just in time for the field trip to recommence. But things rarely go as planned. The parents are striking outside the toy store, throwing up a roadblock. It's now Jeffrey Farmer's time to shine. He distracts them long enough with a made-up charity so Jake could get in and get out. But just as he thinks he's home free, he slips on a patch of ice and his own school bus drives over the bag with the Nintendo in it. If you weren't paying attention, you might think this convenient misfortune is contrived. And with most movies, you'd be right, but not with 8-Bit Christmas. The patch of ice is set up 3 times. First, adult Jake Doyle slips on a patch of ice near a mall Santa while walking along with his daughter. While this isn't a conventional setup for this event, it is an example of circular storytelling. Circular storytelling is a narrative device where the story ends where it began, the protagonist being fundamentally changed by the narrative. A contemporary example of this would be the movie Up. The protagonists wind up in their own neighborhood at the end, but they have come to understand and perhaps even love each other. Their arcs are completed and given closure. In 8-Bit Christmas, the circle begins at the end, with adult Jake slipping on a patch of ice, and ends at the beginning with the loss of the Nintendo. The second setup for this event is the chase scene with Jake's dad at the same mall. He slips on the same patch of ice, giving Jake a head start. And finally, just before Jake enters the building to purchase the Nintendo, the mall Santa warns him about the ice.
Oh, careful there, kid, it's slippery.
Thanks.
The other piece of the puzzle is also set up. The bus has already begun to move because Jake's plan was delayed by the protesting parents. This is the all is lost portion of the Save the Cat structure. The protagonist has suffered a catastrophic defeat and something or someone dies. Blake Snyder calls this the whiff of death, and in 8-Bit Christmas, the Nintendo that Jake just bought has died. This is typically paired with the Dark Night of the Soul, where the protagonist mourns the death and wallows in misery. At this point, the protagonist comes to realize a previously unseen truth, usually delivered by means of the B story. My one criticism of 8-Bit Christmas is that this is handled rather ham-fistedly by the black market toy seller who sold Lizzie's Cabbage Patch Kid to Jake's dad. He tells Jake that he wasn't gonna get what he wanted for Christmas, and he points out that in his feverish quest for the Nintendo, he has failed to appreciate what he has. The film closes with Jake's dad revealing his gift, a huge, sprawling, beautiful treehouse. He had failed to notice it because of his single-minded quest to get himself a Nintendo. This is set up earlier in the film as well. Jake's dad asks him to pick up dog poop from the backyard, but allows him to not do the ones behind the shed. He also has Jake varnish hockey sticks that were made into a trapdoor for the treehouse. Jake learns that the true meaning of Christmas isn't about the things that you get, but to appreciate the people that you have in your life. We then cut to present day and we see that Jake's dad has sadly passed away. And that's the second part of this lesson, that Jake had to appreciate the people that he had because one day they won't be around anymore. 8-Bit Christmas is a wonderful exercise in setup and payoff. Everything you're introduced to in Act 1 comes up regularly in Act 2 and Act 3, including seemingly insignificant details. For example, there's always Christmas cookies in the Doyle household, but Jake's dad never gets to eat any. In the final scene where the treehouse is revealed, he finally gets to eat one. I've watched this film 4 times for this review, and it only seems to get better with each viewing. 8-Bit Christmas shows why formulaic isn't a dirty word, and why these formulae were written down in the first place. So do yourself a favour and watch this film. I promise you won't regret it.